The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in our house when Phil turned to me and said something that would shatter the delicate balance of our marriage. "We're going to take care of my mom and sister from now on. If you can't handle that, we might as well end this." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and I struggled to find my voice. "Why do I have to leave the house? This isn't fair, Phil. You can't just drop this on me." But his face was hard, unyielding, and I knew there was no room for negotiation. Phil had made up his mind, and when that happened, he didn't care about anyone else's feelings, not even mine. No matter how much I pleaded, his response was the same. "If you don't agree, we'll get divorced." I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I had worked too hard to keep our marriage alive, and I wasn't about to let it crumble because of his sudden, selfish decision. But I needed leverage. I knew there was something Phil was hiding, something that could shift the power in my favor. If he thought he could keep secrets from me, he was gravely mistaken. My name is Mandy Reynolds, and I'm 38 years old, a housewife in the second year of my marriage to Phil. We don't have children, though I've always wanted them. That dream seemed to slip further away with every passing day. After we got married, I cut back my full-time work at the hospital to focus on fertility treatments. I thought Phil and I were on the same page about having kids, but as the months passed, it became clear that Phil wasn't as invested in the process as I was. "It'll happen eventually," he'd say whenever I brought it up. "Why stress about it? Look at all those celebrities having babies in their 40s. We're not even there yet." But I knew better. After 2 years, there was still no sign of pregnancy, and Phil brushed off my suggestions to seek medical help. He just didn't want to put in the effort. "It's expensive," he'd say. "Do we really need to go through all that? Why not just leave it to nature?" I tried to explain to him that fertility treatments weren't just about waiting. We needed to know if there was something wrong, something we could fix. But Phil didn't want to hear it. His indifference hurt, but I wasn't about to give up. I covered the cost of the treatments myself with help from my parents, and I kept going to the clinic, juggling my job with the appointments. But it was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. One quiet afternoon, while Phil was at work and I was at home, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, my mind spinning with possibilities. Who could it be? Maybe the clinic? But when I picked up, I heard a familiar voice. "Mandy, it's Julia," Phil's sister said brightly. "Can I come over? I have a lot to talk about." Julia. My heart sank. Phil's sister was trouble, always had been. The last thing I wanted was to deal with her, especially not today. But before I could decline, she continued. "Is Phil home? No? Great. I'll be there in an hour." She hung up without waiting for a response, leaving me no choice but to prepare for her arrival. When Julia finally showed up, I had barely finished my lunch. She waltzed into the house as if she owned the place, her eyes scanning the kitchen. "I haven't eaten yet," she said, glancing at the pound cake on the counter. It was a gift, something I'd been saving for a special occasion. But before I could offer her something else, she reached for the cake and cut herself a huge slice. "This will do." I bit my tongue, trying to remain polite. But as Julia sat down and started talking, I realized I wasn't prepared for what came next. "I'm pregnant," she said casually between bites. He promised me that he'd leave his wife if I got pregnant. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. Julia was openly admitting to having an affair with a married man, and now she was expecting his child. My mind raced. How could someone like her, so reckless and thoughtless, be pregnant when I couldn't even get through a single cycle without disappointment? I felt a knot of anger and frustration rising in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "Does Phil know about this?" Julia shrugged. "Not yet, but he'll understand. I mean, it's not like I can control who I fall in love with." That was Julia, always acting like the world owed her something. I listened in stunned silence as she talked about her affair, how her lover had promised to leave his wife and marry her. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and I didn't want any part of it. After she finally left, I sat in the empty house, wondering how my life had turned into this mess. When Phil came home that night, I told him about Julia's visit, hoping he would share my concern, but instead of supporting me, he turned on me. "You need to apologize to Julia," he said coldly. "She told me you upset her." Apologize? For what? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Julia was the one causing all the problems, but somehow I was the villain in this story. "Phil, she's having an affair. She's pregnant by a married man. How is this okay?" Phil's expression hardened. "Julia is going through a lot. You should be more understanding." I didn't know what to say. Phil's blind loyalty to his sister was infuriating, and no matter how much I tried to reason with him, he refused to see the truth. His sister was spiraling into chaos, and he was letting her drag us down with her. Over the next few weeks, Julia's presence in our lives became unbearable. She called and texted me constantly, seeking advice and sympathy that I wasn't willing to give. Phil, of course, thought it was no big deal. "Just be there for her," he'd say. "She doesn't have anyone else." It wasn't just the phone calls and texts, though. One day, a truckload of boxes arrived at our house, addressed to Phil. I stared at them in confusion, wondering what on earth he had ordered. But when Phil came home late that night, his explanation made my blood run cold. "Julia and Mom are moving in with us," he said casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "We'll be living together from now on." I couldn't believe it. He had made this decision without even consulting me. I had married him, not his entire family. We had barely any contact with his mother and sister since the wedding, and now they were suddenly moving in. "Are you serious, Phil? You can't just spring this on me?" Phil shrugged. "We have a spare room. It'll be fine. They don't have anywhere else to go, and besides, I'm about to be promoted. My salary will increase, so we'll be able to manage." It was like talking to a wall. No matter what I said, Phil wouldn't budge. His family came first, and I was expected to fall in line. But I wasn't ready to accept this new reality. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I had to find a way out of this mess. Phil had made his choice, but I still had mine. I had suspected for a while that something wasn't right with him. There were nights he came home late, smelling of perfume, with vague excuses about work. He had been distracted lately, distant. It wasn't just Julia's drama that was tearing us apart. Phil had his own secrets, and I was determined to uncover them. The next day, while Phil was at work, I sat down at the computer we shared. Phil had always been careless with technology, and today was no different. His email was still logged in. My heart raced as I clicked through the inbox, and there it was, confirmation of everything I had feared. There were emails, sweet and flirty, exchanged between Phil and a woman named Sarah. He had been meeting her regularly, under the guise of late-night work meetings. I scrolled through reservation confirmations for hotels, all under her name. It was all there, laid out in black and white. Phil had been cheating on me for months. A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized the extent of his betrayal. While I had been bending over backward to keep our marriage intact, he had been sneaking around with someone else. But I wasn't about to let him get away with it. I printed out the emails and the hotel reservations, careful to gather enough evidence to confront him. This wasn't just about me anymore. If Phil thought he could play the victim while cheating on me, he was in for a rude awakening. But I had to be smart about it. I wasn't ready to show my hand just yet. Meanwhile, Julia's situation was unraveling quickly. The man she had been seeing wasn't planning on leaving his wife after all. In fact, his wife found out about the affair, and Julia was facing legal consequences. She had no job, no stable income, and now she was being hit with a demand for compensation from the wife. It was chaos, and Julia came to me sobbing and begging for help. "You revealed everything, didn't you?" she accused me one day in the supermarket. "You told his wife about us. You ruined everything." I looked at her calmly. I didn't say a word. But you can't expect to destroy someone's family and walk away without consequences. Julia was furious, blaming me for all her problems, but I stood my ground. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the fallout. Her affair partner had chosen to stay with his wife, leaving Julia alone, jobless, and pregnant. Back at home, things were tense with Phil. He acted like nothing had changed, oblivious to the fact that I was gathering more evidence against him. My mother-in-law had moved in too, and she had her own suspicions about Phil's behavior. One day, we sat down to talk. "I know Phil's been unfaithful," I admitted. "I'm getting ready to leave him, but I need to gather more evidence before I confront him." To my surprise, she didn't react with shock or anger. Instead, she calmly handed me a small envelope. Inside was a bank card. "Use this," she said quietly. "Hire a private investigator. Phil needs to face the consequences of his actions." I hadn't expected this level of support from my mother-in-law, but I wasn't about to turn it down. With her help, I hired a detective who specialized in tracking infidelity. It didn't take long to get the proof I needed: photos of Phil with Sarah, entering and leaving hotels together. Now I had everything. I just needed to decide when to confront him. 2 weeks later, Julia received a letter addressed to her from the wife of her affair partner. She was being sued for $30,000 in compensation. When Phil saw the letter, he was livid. "What's this?" he demanded, snatching the paper from Julia's hands. "A woman's name? Compensation? This is ridiculous. It's probably just harassment." Phil refused to believe that Julia had done anything wrong, even as the evidence piled up. He was blinded by his loyalty to his sister, refusing to see the truth. But I had had enough. "Phil," I said quietly, laying the photos from the detective on the table. "You're not the victim here. You've been cheating on me with Sarah for months. Don't try to pretend this is about protecting your sister." His face went pale as he looked at the photos. For the first time in weeks, he had nothing to say. I could see the fear in his eyes, but I wasn't about to let him off the hook. "I'm filing for divorce," I continued, "and I'll be demanding compensation for everything you've put me through." Phil tried to laugh it off, but there was a desperation in his voice. "Mandy, come on. We don't need to do this. It was just a mistake. You still love me, right?" But I didn't feel anything for him anymore. The love I once had for Phil had been buried under layers of lies and betrayal. I had made my decision, and nothing he said could change that. As I packed my bags and prepared to leave, Phil collapsed at my feet, begging me to stay. But it was too late. He had made his choices, and now he would have to face the consequences. "Goodbye, Phil," I said, walking out the door. "You'll hear from my lawyer." In the weeks that followed, our divorce went through smoothly. I received the compensation I was owed, and Phil's reputation at work crumbled as news of his affair spread. He was transferred to a dead-end position, and his life spiraled further into ruin. Julia, too, faced the consequences of her actions. With no job, no support, and a tarnished reputation, she found herself completely isolated. Her affair partner chose to stay with his wife, leaving her to deal with the fallout alone. As for me, I finally felt free. Free from the lies, the betrayals, and the constant stress of trying to hold a crumbling marriage together. I had found a new partner, someone kind and understanding, who respected me for who I was. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. My past with Phil was behind me, and now I could focus on rebuilding my life on my own terms.